Reform Fringe event. I'm Charles Grant from the CER. As is the tradition at these events, at Tory Party Conference, we always have a good selection of viewpoints on the platform, and we always have a very good-natured, polite discussion, and I'm sure we will this year as we have in previous years. The running order is going to be Bernard, Antoinette, Vicky, and then Juliet, who we're sure is on her way, and she'll be here soon, I'm sure. Some of the questions I hope we touch upon today include questions such as, what are the main obstacles to a deal between the EU and the UK on Brexit? Is there a version of Brexit that most Conservatives can support? Will Parliament push the government to impose a softer version of Brexit than it would like? Is there a serious risk of the talks collapsing? What are the priorities of the EU member states and the EU institutions? And assuming that Brexit happens on time, what will be the impact on Britain and on the European Union? And finally, the real one that none of us knows the answer to, but we might take a stab at it. If Parliament rejects the Brexit deal, which I guess is quite possible, what happens then? That's enough from me. Bernard, give us your own take on these and any other questions. 5 to 7 minutes, then we'll have lots of time for discussion. Thank you.
Right, I won't cover all those questions.
Of course you can. I'm sure there's one or two of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
But first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and a pleasure to be on the platform with my two colleagues. What will be the outcome of Brexit was the top line.
Yes, of course. That's the most important.
And the answer is, it is Conservative MPs who are going to decide that over the next few weeks. And that will determine, very bluntly, whether the UK will be the strong and independent nation that voted to leave the EU, or, despite the referendum decision, we vacillate, accept some kind of defeat, and become a weak and divided country which has lost the will to govern itself, despite voting to govern itself. And it is clear that Chequers would take the UK towards an agreement with the EU, which would not deliver the referendum result. Juliet, hi. I'm sorry we started a little bit early. You've missed one paragraph. Thanks. Chequers would not deliver the referendum mandate. The Leave campaigns were all very clear that leaving the EU meant taking back control over our own laws. And the government's household leaflet, too, made clear that taking back control meant leaving the single market. And I will quote from that leaflet, which went to every household, and incidentally it said there would only be one referendum. No other country has managed to secure significant access to the single market without having to follow EU rules. But the Chequers proposals are about exactly that, about remaining in what is erroneously called the single market for goods, but accepting what is erroneously called a common rule book, which means the EU rule book. Chequers also commits the UK, quotes, through a joint reference procedure to the role of the Court of Justice of the European Union as the interpreter of EU rules, which means unless we abide by the EU rule book as interpreted by the European Court of Justice, full gamut of single market legislation that the EU regards as intrinsic to the single market: environment, social employment, health and safety, state aids, and so on. Now, all these EU laws may reflect desirable objectives and reflect very good intentions, but they should be framed and interpreted by our own democratically accountable institutions and not imposed under threat, because that's what it amounts to, from a foreign power, which is what the EU will be after we have left. No independent country with a free trade deal with the EU has ever made or would make these extraordinarily unequal commitments. And we should recognise that Chequers would consolidate the EU's trading advantage they built up over the UK since we joined, and Chequers would consolidate the EU's 95 billion trade surplus in goods with the UK without reciprocal access for any of the single market and services that has been developed, or indeed without the advantage of being able to adjust our own domestic regulation in order to make our manufacturing more competitive. And that's got there's a lot to think about there. There's going to be a lot of new regulation concerning new industries that are emerging from technology. So there is a far better way, and I would submit that this far better way would get the support of Parliament. The Irish border issue is the only obstacle which blocks the comprehensive bilateral free trade agreement which was offered by Donald Tusk in March 2018 and has now been laid out so clearly by the IEA in their document at the beginning of last week. And the ERG paper published during September sets out how the UK and the Irish Republic could operate a customs frontier with any necessary checks conducted away from the border in the island of Ireland and without any infrastructure on the border itself. And that was the original proposal of the British government, which was supported by two previous Prime Ministers of the Republic of Ireland and was confirmed as policy by both the head of HMRC in our own country and confirmed by the Irish Customs head in Dublin. Now, in the absence of any agreement, and I think that is increasingly likely, and I'm very happy to explain in more detail why I think this is likely in question and answer. But if, in the absence of agreement, Parliament has already legislated to leave the EU without a withdrawal agreement on WTO terms if necessary. The EU Withdrawal Act specifies that the UK will leave on the 29th of March 2019 unless a Minister of the Crown tables an order for a later date. And the Prime Minister has made clear the government is not going to table such an order. There is no parliamentary mechanism to compel a minister to lay an order before Parliament. And it is clear that figures like Tony Blair and Peter Mandelson and Nick Clegg and Andrew Adonis and Gina Miller and so on are backing calls for a so-called people's vote, the second referendum. They don't want to call it a second referendum, but that's what it is. But this too would require the government to bring forward legislation setting out the question and the date and the other matters that you need to settle before you have a referendum. And the necessary bill could not be passed without the support and considerable legislative time in both houses provided by the government, which the government has no intention of doing. So we will leave on the 29th of March 2019. Now, this situation is existential for the Conservative Party and for the nation. To be left with this so-called people's vote, a referendum in which the original question, leave the European Union, they do not intend to have on the ballot paper at all, would be a kind of spurious democracy, rather typical of the tradition of the European Union, which tries to make people vote again in a different way in a referendum if the European Union doesn't like the answer that's been given first time. And it would be a defeat for the British people and for the hope of self-determination as expressed in the first referendum. That vote was a manifestation of deep disillusion with the way laws and regulations and taxes are being decided in secret by a multinational political elite that is largely unaccountable, subject to the lobbying of large foreign-owned multinational companies, big banks and other vested interests. That's how the comitology system in Brussels works. The vote can therefore only be interpreted as a vote against the single market and the customs union and the unknowable foreign courts interpreting our laws. The referendum constituted a democratic mandate and indeed an instruction for the politicians to recover self-government that quite simply must be delivered. And if this is frustrated by a few Conservative MPs who just cannot accept the result, we will all pay a tax.
And I turn to two Tory MPs who have a slightly different take, possibly. Firstly, Antoinette.
So, Charles, one of your questions is what are the key obstacles to an agreement? And I think Bernard has just exemplified what one of the key obstacles to the agreement are, and it's the ERG. The Leave campaign expressly stated when they registered the official campaign that they were not advocating a particular form of Brexit, and that was to be left to parliamentarians to decide after the outcome of the referendum, because they would be the elected representatives that would make the decision on what would be the best form of way to leave. And you can check the registration of the official campaign because that's what it says. Polling just after the referendum, before this was an issue, showed that only 37% of people who voted leave on the basis that they were leaving the single market and the customs union. And in fact, you'll remember that there was a great deal of debate and reassurance by a number of MPs that argued for leave, saying that that didn't necessarily mean that we would be leaving the single market or the customs union, in fact. What you have just seen is the attack on Chequers, and I would argue that Bernard, David Davis, Boris Johnson and others at DEXU had 18 months to come up with a workable solution, and they failed to deliver it. And the IEA paper is not a workable solution, and all the footnotes that support the maths in it come from the IEA or Professor Minford. It's like somebody marking their own homework. So that has been one of the main obstacles, I would argue, because what happens is people hear these loud voices shouting to the right. It gets printed in our national newspapers, and it gets read by foreign diplomats and governments abroad, who then fear that there's a distrust in terms of what the UK government can deliver, and they undermine the negotiating position of our Prime Minister. And that, I would argue, is one of the biggest obstacles to a deal at the moment. In terms of the other obstacle, I would also have to say that we have had lamentable opposition from Jeremy Corbyn. The complete failure of Jeremy Corbyn, A, to make the original arguments in the referendum, and B, the sort of flip-flopping he's done in his party have really not helped. And had we had a better quality of opposition, we might have had a better outcome. And I think his failures and the failures of the Labour Party have been palpable, although I do think Keir Starmer has done quite a good job of holding the Leavers to account in terms of the promises that they made during the referendum campaign, which form the 6 tests that Labour have based their approach on. So let's remember that when those 6 tests are looked at, those aren't the 6 tests of Labour. Those were promises made by Brexiteers during the referendum campaign and assurances that were given to the British public about what would happen if they voted leave. And I would argue that effectively what's been demonstrable over the last 2 years is that those promises and commitments cannot be kept. In terms of the Irish border issue, the ERG paper doesn't deal with it. Boris Johnson and David Davis set up or agreed to the joint agreement that agreed the Irish backstop. And I find it quite extraordinary that they now say they were unaware of what they were signing up to, or not sufficiently across the detail to know what they were signing up to. Quite frankly, I grew up in the 1970s and 80s when the IRA were bombing mainland UK and, of course, the troubles in Northern Ireland. And I would question, if we have the kind of Brexit that Bernard is asking for specifically on WTO terms, Theresa May is quite right when she says that it puts at risk our union. It puts our risk at union not only in Northern Ireland, but also in Scotland, where it's highly likely that Nicola Sturgeon would use that kind of Brexit as an excuse for another independence referendum in Scotland. I would argue that there is only one option on the table that Parliament can unite around at the moment, and that is Chequers, if we can deliver some form of Chequers. I think there's a lot of sabre rattling about MPs that won't vote for it. I think we ought to see what happens, but I think Chequers is the most realistic solution outlined so far, and clearly there are going to have to be further concessions on both sides before that deal or a deal can be concluded. But if that, you asked also, Charles, whether or not Parliament will impose a softer Brexit than the government would like. A, it's going to depend very much on the deal that comes back. But B, I think if Bernard and his colleagues vote against a Chequers-style agreement, I think it's highly likely that what Parliament will vote for is to allow that question to go back to the public. Because if there's deadlock in Parliament and we can't reach agreement, and this isn't a party political issue, it's not an issue that a general election could sort out, then the only other option is to take it back to the people and to ask. And I would argue that's a very high-risk strategy, both for the ERG to follow and anyone else to follow. And I would say that there's no guarantee of what the outcome of that referendum would be, and that would create further uncertainty. And Charles, you will know, because there was a recent publication, that the cost to the UK economy, there was a recent CER publication this week that outlined that the cost to the UK economy has been £500 million a week so far. And you have to question what the result would be if we have further uncertainty. But it may well be that Parliament has no choice, and that is going to depend.
I should just say, before I turn to Vicky, that this event is being streamed. The audio of this event is being streamed on the CR's website. A lot of people weren't allowed in the room because fire regulations wouldn't let us pack the room as full as I would have liked to have packed it. But if those who've missed it, it will be on our website forever. I turn now to Vicky.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you yet again for bringing us all together. And it's great to be here and to see so many people interested. The first thing I want to say is just in broader context. I do believe we were right to have a referendum on Europe. I'd campaigned for a referendum on our membership for over a decade. I remember when I first applied to be an MEP, saying, you know, the single market, the common market that people voted for 40 years ago was not the sort of Europe that we were now part of, and it needed to go to a referendum. And having offered people a referendum, we've got to follow through what they chose. I think someone was joking the other night, you know, are we starting the campaign for the second referendum, or the third, the fourth? Is it a best of 5? At what point do you decide that you just carry on just having more referendum? I don't believe that going through a second referendum would help at this stage. So we do need to deliver it. I represent a constituency which voted leave, but very marginally. It was about 50.5 to 49.5. And I've always said that I would try and use my experience of having been involved in a lot of European negotiations to try and find a solution that worked for both of those who voted leave, but also reassured for some of the concerns of people who voted remain. I don't believe a no deal and a no agreement is attractive. I also don't believe it was what people were promised during the referendum. And Bernard, you and I did a lot of debates together. I always said if we left, we would need to have a different relationship with the single market. You know, we would not be able to stay in the single market as we were before. I couldn't see us being able to accept being rule takers on so many issues. We do need to have a new relationship, but we also told people that trade would continue, and we would find a way through that meant that trade would continue, and the issues such as citizens' rights would be dealt with. And people who come into my constituency surgery with jobs or businesses that rely on their trade with Europe, or who've got married to other people who come from European countries, or have got relatives in other European countries, it's really important we resolve those. And we're at a really crucial point to these negotiations, and it's always true in European negotiations that as you get closer, they intensify, they accelerate. This is a very difficult deal. It needs to be seen to be difficult. Some of what was said at Salzburg by other leaders may have been about positions from a number of other countries last week. It's very clear that it's very confusing to them if they hear from the UK side lots of different ideas coming out. You know, that's not helping the Prime Minister to negotiate if we're all trying to reshuffle the pack of cards for her. So I do believe that we need to try and give her the flexibility to negotiate at the moment. It's not helpful to give her start to say what's right and what's wrong with what the Cabinet's agreed. In terms of what has been agreed, I think there's been a lot of work now done on citizens' rights. You know, the UK said we would agree that unilaterally, but that now seems to move together both sides of there. There's a lot of agreement on the security cooperation that's so key for both sides going forward. There's a lot of agreement on things that are close to my heart, like ongoing science cooperation and innovation. It's important for both of us. There's actually now a lot of agreement on, I understand, on the financial services side, where we won't be anything like a rule taken in financial services. So it's absolutely key to us that we can continue to manage the risks that come with having the world's largest financial centre ourselves here. That means we won't benefit from passporting. It will cost our economy somewhat, but it is important that we have that independence there. In terms of areas to go forward, one of the most difficult, I think one of the things you asked, Charles, is what are the obstacles? And I'm going to get a bit sort of geeky, if I may, on one of the obstacles at the moment, and particularly about some of the issues that are happening around the discussion on customs. So put it in context. You know, Europe and the UK are significant trading partners. The EU27 is our largest trading partner. We're both champions of free trade. And we both believe that to have free trade, you'd have to have fair competition. You can't have free trade if you have an unlevel playing field in competition. That's why we set up that single market, that common market, with that fair competition to underpin it. We've also been champions of strong environmental standards, strong consumer safety standards, and I think Britain will continue to be a champion of those strong standards going forward. I can't see my good voters in Chelmsford allowing us to drop our animal welfare standards or our safety standards on goods. I just couldn't see that happening. And it's really important that we do manage to get this trading relationship right, okay? Every single free trade agreement in the world has some sort of regulatory cooperation on those standards in order to make sure that there is a level playing field for competition. Okay? And the deeper you want the free trade agreement, the more you need to have the regulatory cooperation on the goods that cross the border. Because we're producing things in one country, sending them to another, and we want to respect each other's standards. I'm also a Conservative that's absolutely allergic to unnecessary bureaucracy. I hope we all are allergic to unnecessary bureaucracy. It's one of the reasons that drove me to this party in the first place. If you look at the goods that come into the UK and the EU at the moment, the vast majority of them don't have any tariffs. The government reckons that of the goods post-Brexit that might diverge, it would only be 4% of all goods coming into the UK that might diverge, okay? But unless we can find an agreement on customs, we're going to set up a requirement for bureaucracy on 100% of the goods that cross the channel. So every good that crossed the channel would have to have a customs declaration and a tracing of its rules of origin. And the Treasury reckon that the cost of that paperwork on the 100% of goods, even though only 4% of them might diverge, the cost of that is $6.5 billion a year. That's to our economy. Another $6.5 billion to the European economy. It's 145,000 small businesses who've never had to do a customs declaration before. So the burden of those costs is greatest on small and medium-sized enterprises. And furthermore, then, when you add in the rules of origin, tracking and tracing they have to do on where those components land, that takes you to an estimate of somewhere between 17 and 20 billion pounds a year. Okay?
For the UK or just...
That is just for the UK. Let me remind you, colleagues, that £20 billion a year is what we Conservatives want to find for the future of the NHS. Okay? And that is almost completely unnecessary bureaucracy. And that is why I think it's really important that we try and find a more advanced form of customs cooperation, We've been through the customs partnership. It's not perfect. There's questions with the facilitated customs arrangement, but a way that we have this advanced cooperation. It's not just what happens at the border that is important. It's the paperwork that happens in the warehouse. I just wanted to quickly say, some people then say stay in a customs union. I don't think that works. I don't think next time you want to put sanctions on Russia or Iran, you could have a country the size of Britain, you know, a member of the UN Security Council, not being in control of our own trade policy. That just doesn't work. We need to find a way that we can have that independent trade policy, but also to keep those frictionless goods moving across the border. From the point of view of the Northern Ireland situation, as someone who grew up very close to the border in Northern Ireland and was born in Northern Ireland, it is important to know that you can now move goods backwards and forwards, but it's also important to think that if you're a business in Belfast, you don't need to do a customs declaration every time you buy or sell something with London. I mean, imagine what that would feel like if you were, say, you know, a Venetian glass maker and you had to do a customs declaration sending something to Rome. It just doesn't work with the same country. The Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, says no hard border north-south, but it also says Northern Ireland is an integral part of the United Kingdom, and the rest of the EU need to agree that. Now, in terms of, I've been doing a bit of sort of thinking about how we could strengthen the customs suggestions.
Quite quickly, Vicky.
Very quickly, to try and address some of the questions that Europe have, because they cannot have a system that leaves their manufacturers at an unfair competitive advantage or opens a system for fraud coming in here. So I think we could have a cooperation that would involve stronger responsibilities for companies to make sure that if they're bringing things in at lower tariffs, they have to pay up front. If they ever did that fraudulently, I think there needs to be a role for the organisation OLAF, which is the organisation that looks at counter-fraud across Europe. I think there needs to be a market surveillance network, such as the one that there is in EFTA, and all of these solutions could be brought to work. And that is the way that I think you square the circle, that keep our trade relationship that's key for jobs, but also have a customs system that doesn't put all those completely unnecessary costs on the people who are running small and medium-sized businesses in this country every time they just want to move something across the Eurotunnel.
Thank you very much. Some of Vicky's ideas could actually be extremely influential in resolving the current impasse over customs. So perhaps in the Q&A we may come back to some of the detail on that. Juliet, your turn to now come and tell us. You're a commentator. You work for a very Eurosceptic publication, but your own columns are not particularly Eurosceptic. You're sometimes critical of the EU, sometimes critical of Eurosceptic. So that's why I've asked you to come and give us a balanced overview of how it looks to you. Juliet.
So I'm going to have a slightly different focus than the others because, and I'm going to focus on the deal that will or will not be done in the next 3 to 6 months, because that will actually set the outline for the debate that follows. And essentially, nothing has really changed in the negotiation for a year since last December, except the fact that our government and the Conservative Party has started to confront the choice that the EU wants it to make, and which it was not being honest about when it signed up to the December withdrawal agreement and said that it was a fudge that didn't mean anything. And the choice that the EU wants to force upon us is either you give up economic sovereignty over Northern Ireland, or you sign up to the whole single market shebang with freedom of movement and the ECJ and all the bells and whistles. And that is the choice that is now coming into our sight that was obscured before by a lot of spin and fine words. And however humiliating Salzburg was, perhaps it's just as well that we actually face that choice, or that at least the choice that the EU is trying to make us, force upon us. And the slightly ironic thing, I find at least, is that the Conservative Party seems determined to tear itself apart over Chequers right now, but for the moment, checkers is irrelevant because that's not the debate that is going to happen in Brussels at this point. That is not the piece of paper that our government is or isn't going to sign. There will be no legally binding commitment as to the form of the future deal whatsoever by the end of this first stage of negotiations. So the piece of paper that our government will sign or won't sign is about Ireland and Northern Ireland. And the EU has actually offered us a Canada or maybe a Canada Plus deal, but not for the whole of the UK, only for Great Britain. So Theresa May's choice is to sign on the dotted line, which essentially gives up on unionism, or to say to the EU, we don't find the choice acceptable, we don't accept your terms, we're walking out of the talks now, and we simply won't have a deal. So that is the choice that she has, unless she can drum up a third option, which is to persuade the EU to change its position and to essentially allow for some kind of legal fudge on Northern Ireland in the next 6 months. The only way to do that which is probably not by comparing the EU to the Soviet Union, is to convince the EU and to convince Ireland, which is actually driving the EU's position, that you are seriously considering no deal. Because at the moment, the position in Brussels is that the UK is going to kick and scream, but it's going to sign up in the end. And they have absolutely no incentive whatsoever to make any concessions. That is the reality. The problem is it's very difficult for the government to convince the EU and Ireland that it is serious about no deal. There are 3 reasons. The first is that no deal will be expensive. And although it will cost the EU and us, it will cost us relatively more. It will be an economic shock. The second reason is that our government keeps saying things and then rolling over and forgetting about them. So it insisted that it wasn't going to agree to EU sequencing. It insisted that we wouldn't have free movement during the transition. And then, all sorts of things that we said we were going to insist upon and that were red lines have just been given up. So we have a bit of a credibility problem. And the third problem is Parliament. So let's say that May chooses to walk out of the talks and to say, fine, we're not going to have a deal. And let's say that she even has full cabinet support for that decision. Parliament is going to try everything it can to either send her back into the negotiations, or if that fails, it is going to try and topple her or force her into holding a second referendum. So at that point, her fate and the fate of Brexit will essentially rest with a group of Tory rebels. And we don't know exactly how that will play out, because the choice facing them will be no deal, or I essentially topple my government. So there's one other main thing to note, which is that no deal isn't a single event. It's a series of events. And it's a series of events that actually, one of our problems is that the EU actually thinks this series of events favours its negotiating position and not ours. Because as soon as markets become convinced that no deal is a real possibility, you get the problem of markets running scared. So investment starts to decrease, capital either pauses or leaves the country, at least temporarily, and therefore businesses start to go under, unemployment starts to rise, etc. And there is certainly a core of people in the EU who think that this is the way to sweat the UK into submission. If we take this to the brink, then we'll put the frightens on them, and then they'll have to roll over. So for all the Eurosceptics in this country think that no deal is a good idea, there are some in the EU who think it's a really good idea to talk it up as well, and we won't know exactly which of them is right until we start to reach the point where it looks like a possibility. So even if we if we get to the point where we do have a no deal, it's not simply one event that then is over. It involves essentially all the legal basis of trade suddenly runs out. The UK tries to keep trade going, say. France, say, tries to shut down Calais in order to make it maximally painful for us. And the reason that it will try to do this is because even if we leave without a deal, they still want to extract their £39 billion from us. And ultimately, the cost to us of going for several weeks without trade functioning smoothly will probably be more than £39 billion. So their reasoning is that we will agree to hand over that cash. So for all of these, because of this whole narrative, my bet about what will happen is that Theresa May will probably sign on the dotted line for all she and many of her MPs are saying that they won't. That will then take us to the debate which is starting to be had now about what the future relationship will look like. But that's very likely that will happen under another Prime Minister and another Conservative leader. And the question will then be, does the rest of Britain want to go for Canada plus or minus, or does it want to try and negotiate some elements of Chequers that will keep parts of the single market, and to what degree will the EU agree to that? But essentially that debate won't be under this leader, and it won't be happening this year.
Thank you very much, Juliet, for your ruthlessly objective and sort of unbiased analysis of what's going on. I'm going to throw this open to the floor in just a second, and we've got over half an hour for questions and discussion. We have to stop on the dot of 5. But just let me react in one and say one thing before I throw it open. I agree with you, Juliet, that the EU assumes that the British will cave in and accept a backstop plus a Canada-style free trade agreement. I think you are right to at least raise the possibility that the British will not cave in, because the EU wrongly thinks that we will put our economic self-interest first. I think emotion is probably sometimes more important than economic self-interest. My own view of the current negotiations, having recently spoken to the EU side and the UK side, is it's all about the Irish backstop. On the Irish backstop itself, the two sides are coming together. They're not a million miles apart. The UK will accept an Irish backstop that puts Northern Ireland in a regulatory union with the EU on some issues, on some customs and single market issues, which would require a sea border across the Irish Sea. The UK would accept that in some measure, but only if the EU agrees to some form of common market or single market for goods, which would preclude the need for those checks across the Irish Sea. And at the moment, the EU is, of course, saying no to the common rule book. So what I think is going to happen is, and I'll stick my neck out, within the next few weeks, there will be a son of Chequers. On the common rule book, the UK will come up with something that meets the EU's requirements more than the current version. There'll be a bigger role for the Court of Justice. There'll be more automatic updating of UK law to represent changes in EU law. The scope of the rule book will be extended. There'll be more guarantees that the British won't disrupt or spoil the so-called level playing field and won't cheat by undercutting the EU producers. And the British will offer a different version of the common rule book. It'd be then quite hard for the EU to say no to that. And on customs, there'll be a fudge. I think both sides will commit to the very long-term principle of something called the SDCA, the super-duper customs arrangement, which will allow the British to have their own independent trade policy and allow trade to be frictionless using blockchain or something none of us understand. And both sides will say this is a great long-term objective. In the interim, brackets rather long interim, Britain will be in a customs union. That is what the UK will end up offering the EU. I know some member states would say yes to that, the Dutch, perhaps the Irish, perhaps the Swedes, French and Germans, not sure. I don't know, but I think that's the next step in the negotiations. And if the EU insists on saying no, 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 that the four freedoms are indivisible, that you can't be in the single market for goods unless you accept free movement of labour and the single market and services, if the EU says that, I think there'll be no deal. But that's enough from me. Put some thoughts on the table. Who'd like to ask a question from the floor? The gentleman in the middle. There is a roving microphone.
Thank you. Is it on? You can hear me, right. I thought it was quite interesting that of all of the panel, only one panel member talked about Jeremy Corbyn and sort of blamed Jeremy Corbyn for what's been going on, which struck me as sort of an interesting situation. He's the leader of the opposition. We tried Project Fear recently, didn't work. We're trying the same with Jeremy Corbyn. We tried it last general election, didn't work then either. I think we've got to be very careful that at the end of the day, we've got to remember that at the last election, 85% of the electorate voted for parties which were offering leave. Whether we think that's right or wrong is irrelevant. That was how they voted. And at the end of the day, there will be another election, and we've got to be very careful that we as Conservatives, again, whether you like it or not, Theresa May said Brexit means Brexit. She talked about the Lancaster House one, keeps being brought up, and that's what people seem to want. If we don't deliver it as a party, then the people who will take power will be Jeremy Corbyn. Because we're trying all these other things, but he is sitting there, in my view, he's playing a blinder at the moment. He's playing around, messing around with all sorts of mixed messages, but the problem is he's still there, he's trying to do both things at once, and he's sort of succeeding, sadly. And if we as a party don't actually get an agreement eventually, that people, the 85% who wanted to out, if they don't do that, then I think Jeremy Corbyn will become Prime Minister.
Okay, let's take a handful of questions and we'll come back to our panellists. The first person I saw was John Peat from The Economist, then we'll move to the left. We'll get to the other side of the room in due course.
I'd just like to ask Bernard to elaborate a bit more on what he said about Parliament. He seemed to be saying that Parliament couldn't do anything without the government's agreement. He isn't a constitutional expert more than I am, but my understanding was that after the 21st of January next year, Parliament will have the option to have a motion that it can amend to instruct the government to do things, possibly to ask to withdraw the Article 50 letter, or possibly to call for a people's vote. I don't know whether the rest of the panel agreed with Bernard that actually Parliament can't do anything. Good question. There's somebody, the gentleman with glasses and white hair in here. Yeah.
George Muir, member from Fulham. I was fascinated, really, by two speakers, all three, all of you. Good. Juliet, do you agree with Charles Grant that will be what will happen?
Okay. The gentleman behind you standing up.
It's a question for those supporting Remain. You seem to be in love with the EU, but if you look at the figures, we have a 90 billion increase in our trade deficit with the EU since the year 2000. That's because we're trading in an unfair market because Germany and Holland and Belgium have got an undervalued currency. And that has damaged our economy. In terms of manufacturing, it's cost about 1 million jobs. Yet with the rest of the world, that you say is terrible, we actually have an increasing surplus. So this country is trading very successfully with the rest of the world. It is increasing jobs, increasing GDP, and the reverse is the case with the EU. And the EU is a declining market. It's gone from 35% of the world market down to 15. It will be down to 10. And we're locking ourselves into all these regulatory burdens to hang on to this unsuccessful and declining bit of our economy. It doesn't make any sense.
Okay, thank you. Let's take one more on this side of the room and then we'll go back to the other side of the room. No. Okay, no more on this side. Anybody else want to last? Okay, the last round of this question. Then we'll get to then we'll come back to the panel and do the other people. So.
Thank you. Julian Wolfson, I'm an investor. Could we put together Charles's scenario that the UK makes another offer, the EU turns it down, and then Theresa May calls an election on the point of keeping the UK together? What does the panel think the outcome of that would be?
Interesting. Well, that's plenty of questions. Perhaps we should go first to Bernard, since some of them are aimed at you and you've waited longest to speak. Well, so Bernard.
Thank you for all those questions. I will. Some of them are more in the form of comments, and I won't spend too much time on them. On this question that John Peat raises, Parliament can't do anything. Well, of course, Parliament can do lots. It could remove the government. But in our system of democracy, the government proposes and the Parliament disposes. We don't have government by Parliament. And the government controls the legislative timetable. And even if there was a motion that said Parliament has decided there should be a second referendum, or Parliament has decided that Article 50 should be extended, it's up to the government whether they accept that. And if Parliament doesn't like it, they can put down a motion of no confidence in the government. So it comes down, in the end, to the will of the government and the question as to whether the government continues in office. Now, some people may say that the Parliament should be able to instruct the government what to do. In some certain very narrow constitutional areas, there is precedent for that through what is known as an humble address, and there was a row about producing documents. But that doesn't extend to instructing government how to legislate. On the general point that Juliet made and the prognostications you were making about the future, they're all premised on the idea that in the end Parliament accepts a deal. I'm afraid I think it's unlikely Parliament's going to accept such an invidious deal. Bear in mind the withdrawal agreement is itself pretty invidious. We're going to be subject to EU lawmaking without any say in the institutions making those laws for 21 months. Effectively, the legislation required to implement the withdrawal agreement will be undoing the Act of Parliament we've just passed in order to leave the European Union. The EU Withdrawal Act, as we've just passed it, suspends sections 2 and 3, suspends the European Communities Act. Well, the EU Withdrawal Agreement Act will suspend the application of that act. We will effectively remain in the European Union but not participating in the European institutions. And for that privilege, we're going to pay a very great deal of money. Now, I'd be prepared to support that if the government delivered its original intention that it was going to secure a cast-iron commitment to a very good deal when we leave. But it now looks as though we're going to be left with something of a short political declaration about which, well, will be, I mean, what it is it's not going to be an implementation period, as the Prime Minister originally called it. It's going to be a continuation of the negotiation. And I think Parliament will look very askance at this. And just on, I'm going to make very, very briefly a point about leaving on WTO terms. It's not correct to call it, it means that we might leave without a withdrawal agreement, though it is pretty obvious that there will be quite a number of quickly formulated side agreements to prevent chaos, because in the end the European Union is not going to want to inflict chaos on itself and us. The aeroplanes will fly. Somehow the Germans will want to carry on selling us all their cars. Somehow the French will want to carry on selling us their cheeses. And the idea that there's going to be some sort of blockade of the United Kingdom because we haven't signed an agreement, so that we finish up with dire terms of trade with the European Union, which the European Union hasn't inflicted on any other country in the world for any other reason. I mean, this will not make the European Union look very good if they carry it. So I think there's a lot of bluff about all this. And the second point, there are two other points I would make. First of all, this figure that we've heard, that somehow it's going to cost £20 billion to the UK economy to trade across the customs frontiers with the EU. This figure is preposterous. It can't, I mean, if you extrapolate that to, say, the trade that Switzerland does with the EU, they trade a very much higher proportion of their GDP. They trade a very high proportion of their exports with the yes, but they trade across a customs frontier. Everything they export to the EU is subject to a customs declaration, and the 20 billion figure you quoted, of our, just a minute,
as well.
I didn't interrupt you. The 20 billion figure that you quoted of our 274 billion exports to the EU, that's about 20%. That's about 7%. A 7% cost of exporting to the EU. Well, somehow the Swiss government has reported that the cost of compliance checks for their export is less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% of the value of their exports. Now, I just think we need a bit of really. The world trades across customs frontiers, and people don't complain about it; they get on with it. And the idea that this is going to be some cataclysm for our economy, I think, is another of the fantasy fears that are being promoted by people who all the way through this debate have promoted fantasy fears, and none of them has yet come true. None of them. We were meant to be in a state of...
100 million a week, Bernard.
Well,
it's cost us so far.
I'd love to know the provenance of that figure. That's not an official statistic that's been through the Office of National Statistics. And these phony forecasts that the Treasury keeps producing have not produced... The Treasury forecast we would have 800,000 more unemployed, and that we would be in recession by this time now just because we voted leave. Well, the reverse has happened. The economy's carried on growing. Inward investment has carried on coming into the United Kingdom. And so I think the Remainers are crying wolf once too often. And okay. I'll tell you this, the British people don't believe them anymore. And they would rather take the risk. They would rather take the risk of leaving without an agreement, saving all that money, and getting free of the European Union than be bullied into submission by a European Union that clearly hasn't even got the interests of its own citizens at heart.
Okay, thank you. No, there's lots of people want to come in, so can our panellists be relatively brief in their answers? But firstly, Antoinette, then Vicky, then Juliet.
We heard all these assurances before. We only have to look at WTO and the fact that Donald Trump is blocking an appointment to the WTO judge, which means that disputes can't be settled by the WTO, to see what a difficult mess that would be. And that's in the context of the US increasingly ramping up the prospects of trade wars around the world. These so-called nations, and look at the way that Trump has treated people he has got free trade agreements with, Canada and Mexico.
He's just reached agreement with Canada.
Yeah, he's just, at what price?
Just reached agreement with Canada.
And given the size of our economy and America's economy, and the fact that Trump may well be in power for quite some time yet, and we don't, you know, I would argue that that is a very high-risk scenario for the UK economy, and a no-deal Brexit is absolutely catastrophic for my constituents and the North West. Our key sectors car manufacturing, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, the aerospace industry, all highly paid, highly skilled jobs that we are putting at risk. And as Vicky said earlier, in terms of the Common Rule Book, I haven't met a manufacturer yet that wants to manufacture a washing machine with different standards in the UK to that in Europe. Manufacturers are not worried about a common rule book, and we are talking about safety standards, consumer standards. In fact, we have set many of those rules. It has been Britain that has been leading in Europe on many of those rules. And if you look at the airline safety regulations, those largely derived out of the UK. If you look at some of the standards that were set in Euratom, we were the country that was leading it. And it simply is false for Bernard to talk about this faceless, unaccountable European bureaucracy. There is a democratically elected parliament in Europe. There is... No, I'm not advocating a return, sir. You raised the question around so-called Remainers. I voted for Article 50. I have supported the withdrawal agreement, but I am not prepared to inflict a no-deal Brexit on my constituents, given the enormous economic cost that would mean for this country. And that is not what people were promised in the referendum, as I outlined earlier. All sorts of scenarios were floated. And I really think that those that argue that WTO is a solution need to take their head out of the sky and actually look at what the impact is on their constituents. And I, for one, am not prepared to support that. I think it is... You see how Bernard has undermined the negotiating position of the Prime Minister. And I really don't think... I do not think... Well, the whole... Canada Plus is not what the Prime Minister is arguing for. She's actually arguing for a much more ambitious deal that would lead to much better trading terms with the EU and a much better outcome for jobs and business in the UK and for my constituents. In terms of what Parliament can do, it's not only a question of deciding of the government proposes and Parliament decides. I think there is a lot that Parliament can do, and I don't think there are going to be many Conservative MPs that are going to vote for a general election, because quite frankly, I think the way that the party has been behaving would lead to a very negative outcome if we had that general election. And therefore, and as I said earlier, a general election, this isn't a party political question. It's about our future relationship with the EU that isn't on party lines. The Labour Party cannot agree their approach, and the Conservative Party, I would argue, needs to give the Prime Minister the opportunity to go out and negotiate Chequers and see if she can land that deal or son of Chequers.
Thank you very much. Vicky.
So we're at the Conservative Party conference, and I hope that we can absolutely agree that the worst possible outcome would be having Jeremy Corbyn in number 10. Okay? I find it incredibly challenging, some of this discussion, because I always tell my kids that please don't have your fights in public, and please have the respect for each other. And I think, you know, Bernard is my neighbour. We both campaigned for a referendum. We need to respect that referendum. We've always wanted to protect jobs and incomes in Essex and in our constituencies, and that is what we are fighting to do. I have never voted against the government. I will never vote to topple the government, and I find that quite unacceptable language to be having as somebody who's been elected for 5 years.
I'm not.
Okay? In a fixed-term parliament, we should not be working on any other premise. In terms of what the negotiating position the Prime Minister has, let us be very, very clear. This is coming from someone who ended up in her last job. I chaired that Internal Market Committee, the Single Market Committee in the European Parliament, which Brit had always done ever since it started up. This is not a deal to try and keep us in the single market by the back door, okay? I read this. This is not us in the single market in goods. This is a relationship based on a free trade agreement, but the closest one possible. Yes, our trade is growing with other parts of the world. That's great, and will continue to do so. But let's not tear up our trading relationship with our nearest neighbour as well, and let's try and see if we can make that work. So let's be very clear what the Chequers deal does, okay? We will be leaving the single market and the customs union. We will not be part of the common fisheries policy, no fishing, no farming, no financial services. In fact, no financial services, no services legislation at all. We will not have that home-host relationship or passporting. It will, I hope, mean that we will have frictionless trade on goods, because I believe that it is worth fighting for creative solutions that can deliver that. We will be able to sign trade deals with other parts of the world. There will be no more free movement. We will have our own control of our immigration policy, and there will be an end to huge contributions to the EU budget. Why do I think it's worth fighting for a deal on how we run our customs relationships with each other? It's partly because I do not want to see the United Kingdom split in half. Okay, I am a Conservative and a Unionist. I don't want to have to go back to hard borders. I want to find other, more intelligent solutions, and I believe it is possible to work towards more intelligent solutions. Just in terms of the costs and the estimates here, I think we have to be honest with what we're suggesting. I'm not suggesting we're like Switzerland, Bernard, because Switzerland is in EFTA, which means Switzerland has to follow every single EU rule, including on financial services.
They have to make a customs declaration for everything they export.
And that is not what is being suggested. But I do think that when you've gone through a trial with those 145,000 small businesses who said, I'm not in a position to be able to do those customs declarations because I don't have the capacity to do that and the cost is going to be huge, then we should be trying to find alternative solutions and not saying no to them. And that is why I think we should allow the Prime Minister time to get on with her negotiations. We shouldn't be using words like vassal state, because this is not a vassal state. If I look at my 8 years in the European Parliament, where did we ever disagree on the single rule books on goods? It was on washing up gloves, okay? That was it, okay? We agreed that we wanted the same safety standards on washing machines, bike helmets. You know, we're not going to want to have two sets of rules, okay? And I don't think it's worth tearing up our whole trade relationship with Europe because we want to potentially in the future maybe do something different about a pair of marigold washing up gloves. For goodness sake, let's get practical and save jobs.
I'll hand over to Juliet now, and then let's leave time for some questions afterwards. But Juliet first.
So, Chequers, or son of Chequers, I think it's quite clear from this debate that the government doesn't have more room to move. There are very few more concessions that it can make while keeping its coalition together. And so I think if it produces a son of Chequers that essentially concedes on a wide range of points, that it will lose much chance of getting it through Parliament, which I think is already quite risky at the moment. I also think it would be crazy to try and go for an election right now. In terms of the no deal and the cost of no deal, I mean, the fact is it will be expensive, and however it pans out, whenever you have a major economic adjustment, it's wise to give businesses and people time to process that adjustment, not least for also the government to set up all the structures and the laws necessary. And if you look at, I was in Liverpool last week at Labour's conference, and one of the major messages that John McDonnell said was, the greater the chaos, the greater the opportunity to be radical. He wants to take over in a chaotic situation, and I suggest that the Conservatives don't provide that opportunity. In terms of customs, I spent 5 weeks going around different ports in the UK, and I tend to actually agree with Bernard that I don't think the cost of customs is a huge make or break thing, provided you get the time to develop systems that will make it relatively painless. I spoke to trade technology providers who said, yes, I can design a system like that, but it will take me 18 months, and then I need 18 months for people to learn how to use the system, including a lot of small businesses. So I think that that is doable, and I think that the risk that businesses underestimate is that if we sign ourselves up wholesale to a European rule book, yes, we avoid friction, but we expose ourselves to all sorts of regulations that other countries want to implement that benefit them to our disadvantage. And I have followed EU negotiations where you can see countries specifically putting forward regulations because it suits their banks or it suits their insurers. It happens all the time. The EU isn't some enlightened, amazing regulatory project that just produces, regulations we could never think of. It's essentially a forum for managing a sort of mercantilist struggle on regulations, and if we sign ourselves up to that wholesale with no institutional protection, I think that's a big risk for the economy.
Thank you. Let's see, can I see who wants to still ask a question? Okay, let's try and fit in a few more, then we'll come back to our panel. We can't fit in everybody, but let's go to this side of the room. The gentleman at the back with glasses, then we'll come to the front.
Thank you. Can I just take you up on your remark about Northern Ireland being in motion? About a mile from here, in 1974, in the pub next to where my younger brother worked, a bomb went off. He had left that pub 20 minutes before the bomb went off. One of his workmates was still there when it went off and didn't come out alive. This is not a matter of emotion. If the Northern Ireland border goes wrong, and we go back to the people will die. And we have to recognise that this really is, for those, I can remember the agony of my parents waiting to hear whether my brother's all right. So please, can we get real about this? That we're talking about life and death here. Now, can I take up my old friend Bernard's comment?
Briefly, please.
Very quickly, about Aesop's fables. The entire point about Aesop's fables was that the boy cried wolf, 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 and the last time the wolf came. And there's, I think, some evidence it's beginning to come. So I think we should adopt Bernard's suggestion of Aesop's fables and recognise there might be a rather dangerous wolf waiting at the end of this.
Okay, let's come to the front now, on this side. Yeah. Wait for the microphone if you could, it's on its way. And then,
Thank you. John Fifield, Weaver Vale, Cheshire. Might I suggest that if there is no deal and France thinks about putting a border in place and not cooperating with us, it won't happen because of the repercussions that it would have in Ireland, which will still be one of its members.
Right, okay, there's somebody else, the lady at the back in the middle, and then we'll have one more on this side if we can squeeze it in. Yeah.
Thank you, Beverley Connolly, Tandridge District Council. I'd like to ask a question of all the panellists, please. Did you honestly, hand on heart, ever really believe that the European Union would give us a deal in the first place? Because I could have told you from the get-go that there's no way that they would really be offering us a deal, because it would mean that all the other countries that are waiting to hear what's going to happen about our Brexit will be queuing up behind us to leave. We are in this situation because of the European diktats that didn't even give David Cameron the crumbs from their table. If he'd have come back with a few concessions, we may not even have had that referendum. But we are in the position we are in now because of them and nothing else. And something else I'd like to say about the promises that were made during the referendum. I remember campaigning for leave. I don't remember making any promises to people. People voted to leave because they wanted to be free and independent. And it's nothing to do with promises. It was to do with leaving the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. There's somebody at the back on the left.
Thank you very much, Charles. Matthew Holhouse from the MLEX news agency. I'm curious to know whether other members of the panel agree with the point I think Antoinette raised it about Scotland. 18 months ago, the Prime Minister agreed with Nicola Sturgeon that now would not be the time to hold a independence referendum in Scotland until the course of the Brexit negotiations was clear, the type of deal was clear to the Scottish people. Do you share Antoinette's fear that a no-deal scenario would put Nicola Sturgeon in a very difficult position to again defer a second Scottish independence referendum? Would it be a gift to the nationalists that are agitating for that right now?
Right, last question, the gentleman here. Sorry, the older gentleman with glasses. Sorry to everybody else.
I don't like to Graham Jones from West Lancs. Can we hear more about the DUP angle on the backstop? Will they agree to the border down the Irish Sea?
Okay, sorry to those who are clarifying something that was said about the CR's research published on Monday, £500 million a week cost of Brexit. What the research says is our economy is today 2.5% less big than it would have been without the referendum. Not a dramatic change. Before you condemn that as just biased, plucking numbers out of the air, do read the methodology. There's a methodology after the piece itself on our website which explains how we got to those statistical conclusions. That's enough from me. Let's start again with Bernard, then go down the list. Bernard,
no disrespect to your forecast, but they are speculative, and we just don't know. We don't know. To my old friend about Northern Ireland, my father was in the Grand Hotel in Brighton, so I take very seriously the point you make. But at the launch of the ERG paper on the Irish border, we had one of the architects of the Good Friday Agreement who made it very clear that actually it's the EU's and Varadkar's proposals which are threatening the stability of Northern Ireland, inflaming the situation. And also, it's very important to remember this. I have tried, and I cannot find a single European official or single Irish minister who says they are going to erect infrastructure at the border and create a hard border if we leave the European Union without an agreement. And the Prime Minister has refused, made it perfectly clear, we're not going to erect any infrastructure at the border. So if we leave without an agreement, there will be no infrastructure at the border. And the European Union will have to accept that because they won't be able to find a single Irish politician that will do it for them because everybody knows it would be crazy. Everybody agrees we don't want infrastructure at the border.
Okay,
and
that's your minute.
So, okay. The point about France is absolutely right. The cheesemakers and the wine producers would be rioting in the Champs-Élysées pretty quickly if the French government was blocking their exports to the United Kingdom, which is why I've consulted around the logistics and transport industry and people who run ferries. They think it's completely incredible that this blockade idea is going to be a reality if we leave without an agreement. So I'm just on Scotland, very important on Scotland. What is risking a second referendum in Scotland is the idea that we have a second referendum on the EU. That's what's going to set a precedent for having second referendums. And incidentally, I think what a lot of voters in Scotland I've met, they rather regret they didn't vote leave. The only reason they didn't vote leave, not because they wanted to stay in the European Union, but they were told that if they voted leave, it would threaten the place of Scotland in the United Kingdom. They now wish they had voted leave. If they had voted leave and Scotland had voted leave, and it wasn't by a very wide margin, that they voted Remain. If Scotland had voted leave, then Nicola Sturgeon would absolutely have nowhere to stand on this issue. And
okay,
maybe if there was another referendum, that's what happened.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Vicky, sorry, only 1 minute. Apologies for
First
that.
of all, on the question of would France or Ireland put up border checks, nobody wants to put up border checks.
Exactly.
But if we leave under WTO terms without some form of customs arrangement, they have to, otherwise they are in breach of their obligations with free trade agreements with other parts of the world.
That's complete
and
rubbish.
that is, we uphold international rules and we shouldn't force other countries to not do that. That's why I think it's worth spending time finding a solution. In terms of other countries lining up to leave, which the lady asked this question, very interestingly, that was a thought at the beginning, but the Swedish elections just last month turned into an election on Swexit at the last few days of the election, and it was expected that the Swedish Democrats who were promoting Swexit were going to landslide in, and they well underperformed their expectations. Other countries are not lining up to leave in this way. Yes, the EU needs change. Yes, it's an organisation that is out of contact with people, but there aren't other countries. And I do think it is possible to find a relationship that works, that takes back control of our borders, our money and our laws, but also keeps that sort of partnership and keeps our trade going in a way that is frictionless.
Thank you. Antoinette.
So in terms of the DUP backstop, let's not forget this agreement was signed off by the Brexiteers in government, Johnson, Davis and et al. It was an agreement that went through Parliament, effectively was endorsed in December, and what we're seeing is what we see the whole time, Brexiteers trying to undermine the position and row back on things that have been agreed. In relation to the border in France, WTO rules require borders. It is a requirement of the WTO rules that you have a border. So all this nonsense of we won't put up a border, if you don't have a border, if you agree terms, in terms of most favoured nation status, whatever concession you give to the EU applies to every other single country in the world that is a member of WTO. So you undermine all your industries, you undermine agriculture, you undermine the product standards, you have to give exact most favoured nation status means that you have to give that deal to everyone in the world. And that it will cause huge damage to British industry. And yes, I do think the EU outlined very clearly what options were available to Britain and what deal it would offer to us. And there are a number of off-the-shelf models. And my argument is not that we should remain in the EU, but that we should be looking at the EEA-EFTA as our alternative to no deal and using that as the basis for what has been called for many, many years of the two-speed Europe. And our default position should not be no deal, but should be EEA-EFTA.
Okay. Last word to Juliet.
On the question of Ireland's interests, I think if it came to it, Ireland's interests would really quickly fall by the wayside. And I think that, if it came to a question of whether or how to deal with, how to behave in a no-deal scenario, I really don't think Dublin would get much of a look in terms of what Brussels decided to do. As to whether you would see people putting up infrastructure on the Irish border, I think that is unlikely. I'm not an expert in WTO rules, but I think there are some provisions for exceptional circumstances as long as you could, you'd have exceptions in the meantime while you worked out some legal framework for it. On the question of Scotland, no, I don't think Northern Ireland is any precedent for Scotland because it doesn't share a land border with the EU. So it's a pretty weak argument to say that Northern Ireland's circumstances apply to Scotland in any measure. And as for the DUP, I think I think they probably would go along. I mean, depending on how the degree to which face-saving measures were offered to fudge the Irish border issue or to make it appear less painful, I think they might go along with May signing up to what the EU is offering.
Right, one final footnote from me. I think whatever the WTO rules say about the Irish border, and we've heard different opinions here, I'm quite sure, having talked to people in the EU Commission about this, if there's no deal, the EU will insist that its customs union and its single market be policed on the borders of those two entities, because there's no example in the world of a customs union and a single market not being policed.
But it would be policed away from the frontier.
Hopefully, yes. Anyway,
that's the point.
That's enough from me. Can we thank our panellists, please?